Tonight, the Friends of the Department of Architecture is proud to announce our guest lecturer, David Niland. And I guess I've been doing a lot of hype about him lately in my classes and so forth. So I'll just briefly introduce him. He teaches at the University of Cincinnati. He teaches sixth-year design, which is thesis. That's his primary teaching assignment. He also teaches a studio in the summer, a theory studio. He's been at the University of Cincinnati since, what, 1962, 63, something like that. He's a full professor, and he's a practicing architect in Cincinnati, dealing primarily with residential design. I don't know if there's anything more I should say about him. David Niland.
Who's working the machine? Okay.
Do you have a plug-in over there, or no?
Yeah, switch. Well, you mean I have control of my own desk? You're well equipped. For those of you who have multiple demands on your time or are here under duress, I'll to tell you at the outset that while I plan to pack 2 pounds in a 1 pound bag, I'll try and keep the festivities limited to perhaps an hour, which means obviously we'll go over that, but the intentions are correct. I will use I, not because I'm self-enamored, or because I have any more than the normal ego problem. I will use I to illustrate or differentiate between what I consider to be personal theory, belief, priority, and aspiration, in the hopes that it will not be mistaken for fact. I have always had a very dim view of speakers who, and particularly those from out of town, because they can always get out of town afterward, who come in, mount a podium, and then couch their own personal idiosyncrasies and prejudices as if they were dealing with immutable facts. I'm here to talk to you about constants and variables, not to offer a little jiffy design kit or a panacea, because I have yet to meet anyone with the messianic context to do that. I would like to present to you the prospects of dealing with design from a vantage point which suggests that one may select from the options and the opportunities of design possibilities. From those possibilities distill probabilities, and from the probability extract the direction that you take, suggesting all the while that it really isn't necessary, that you're enamored or in love or infatuated or overwhelmed by what you're doing at an emotional level. And I would suggest to you that this approach is one that artists have taken for years, and that brings us to the first star on my notes and the stumbling block. To suggest that architecture is an art form today does not place one at the epicenter of popularity. We have people who are functionalists. There's nothing wrong with that. The postmodernists, of course, tell you that in order to be humanistic, it's necessary to throw in the face of our friends, mothers, cousins, and colleagues the kind of easily identifiable symbols that most of us became familiar with in our childhood, even though a childhood for you has to now extend back to 1930 to 1830, which is a neat trick. suggest to you that the purpose of architecture, the purpose of art, is to evoke an emotional response. That's the purpose, and as a purpose, that's so damn general that it's almost devoid of a capacity to lend direction. But if one says that it would be nice if architecture could evoke a strong emotional response, then for that, perhaps that gives some impetus. And if we add to that architecture desirably could evoke a strong positive emotional response while we're beginning to generate a little momentum, and if it can be a strong positive emotional memorable response, now we're beginning to get at the business that separates architecture from simple buildings. The purpose of any art form, and I'm absolutely, totally, 100% biased, and the purpose of architecture is to enrich the lives of those who come in contact with those works. And there's nothing, by definition, that is anti-functionalist about it. I would submit to you that there's no magic in functionalism. I doubt that there's a teenage supermarket bag boy who on the first day at the job doesn't realize very quickly that you don't put a dozen eggs, a carton of milk, and a loaf of bread under a 50-pound bag of kitty litter unless you're after the stuffed French toast is made. Function is marvelous, but it is not an end in itself. The populist movement, the humanistic movement is another aspect of art that causes those who cry elitist to recommend that anyone who practices art is not a part of the mainstream or cannot take the pulse of his peers or fellow man. I would reject that as well. Now, I'm getting to the lecture. It's just necessary to set the stage, to offer the ground rules, and throw in a few disclaimers before doing so. If that's the purpose of architecture, then what perhaps can one use as a definition? I'm not really quite sure why it's so difficult to forge or fabricate a definition of anything. One can read of the dozen or so definitions, cum philosophies of architecture, that Frank Lloyd Wright fabricated for himself during the course of his career, which really covered normally about 6 or 7 careers, which shows his dexterity and his elasticity all the way to the grave. For me, architecture is the realization of a manifest order, appropriately conceived, logically developed, conditioned in discipline, coherent through consistency, animated with wit, and enlivened with spirit. And I grant you, that's a real lump. Now, I don't want anybody to suffer from terminal apoplexy at this point because I don't plan to deal with these 1 potato, 2 potato, 3 potato, 4. I want to extract 3. Conditioned in discipline, coherent through consistency, and animated with wit. And order, not the order. The order went out with Adolf and Benito and National Socialism and fascism. And order, not something for me that necessarily has to tap into the universal cosmos. An order, one of an infinite number of orders that are available to the architect as he goes about the business of designing. Where do you start design? Isn't it a marvelously reassuring moment when you get the program for design and you look at it and you think, my God, what am I going to do with this? And you think about the individual who has just inflicted this pain upon you, and you question if perhaps it's not time for a revolt or at least some clandestine backstabbing. Where do you begin design? Lou Kahn used to say that architecture went from the immeasurable through the measurable and back to the immeasurable. One starts design, and there is no way to start design. You can throw balls in the air, darts at the door. Design comes out of something which is probably so nebulous and so untidy and so uncertain that whatever our worries may be for the future, they do not include the computer usurping our primacy. Architectural design cannot be charted. It starts with the emotional, it starts with the intuitive. But once it has a start, it can be taken through stages of progression. Communication is its purpose. That's so obvious it's corny and trite. Communication, however, is the touchstone and the essence of architecture. If you cannot communicate, you cannot get a message across. And if you share the aspiration that architecture is to evoke some kind of response from those who come in contact with it, then the architecture has to be able to set up a dialogue. And it's a dialogue between an inanimate object and human response. And it's a communication that must be delivered by an order, since no architect can stand by each of the buildings he designs, and as people go by, grab them by the shirt sleeve and say, well, let me tell you about my building. Or if he can't do that, he still isn't available to hand out librettos. It just doesn't work that way. The building must have sufficient cogence and resonance to speak for itself. In my scheme of things, this brings us to the stage where progressively one moves from concept, this is design concept, to strategy, design strategy, to tactics, design tactics, to techniques, to technology. Not engineering technology, design technology. I frankly am in a stage in my life where I'm not sure what concept is. At least not architectural concept. I do understand the other kind. I wonder if concept isn't just a generality that gets us off dead center, and perhaps the nuances, the subtleties, the ramifications, and the breadth of concept someplace along the line is made known to us once we become immersed in and intimate with what we are trying to do. From this collection of reference points, we finally arrive at the stuff of substance, the hardware from which design is made. And I would suggest that that can be divided into three categories: size and shape, treatment, and orientation. Size and shape is self-evident. Treatment, what do you do with the size and the shape? Treatment is pattern, texture, figure, ground, light, illumination, opacity, transparency, translucency, visual density. If you have an anything, how many different ways can you treat it, and in a very simple fashion, and how does that treatment alter or change? Orientation. Well, let's play a game. Perhaps this will be easier. If you have a collection of disparate sizes and shapes, what? A pencil, a necktie, perhaps a miniature brass copy of the Eiffel Tower that your auntie got when she visited Paris in 1920, a coffee cup, and you want to bring these elements into conjunction with one another. If you spray them white, they're all white, that will do it. But if you spray them day-glow orange, because that's an assertive color, and you can put them any place, somehow they will coalesce into a unit. Disparate sizes and shapes which are brought together and made whole by a common treatment. Or if you have pens, flow pens, and you have one this high, and of course then the normal. They are different in size and shape, but the way flow pens are designed on the outside, there is a commonality. The Coca-Cola people have used it for years. You have the original Coca-Cola bottle that was one gulp. I think it was 6 ounces. Then proliferation took place, and I don't remember where it went from there, perhaps to 8. But it's wonderful to see how that rather fluid, sensuous female form has been elongated over the years until now. We have something that comes with wheels on it. It's good business. Advertising people, sales managers, the development of marketing programs use treatment as a common constant to bring things of different size and shape together. Let's go back to size and shape as a constant, treatment as a variable. those flow pens that you have upstairs, if you're affluent enough to have a full set and nobody's stolen them, I think there are probably about 20 in the set. The only way you can tell the black from the Michael Graves mauve or the Bobby Stern sienna is by the color that's on the outside, and that's a reflection of what's on the inside. Orientation, if you want to draw attention to a vagary or a variation on a theme, you might take the same flow pens. Set them up so they're all vertically oriented or perpendicular to your own position of address. And you want to play a game with one of your peers, choose the most special one. And of course, if they're all lined up, there ain't no special one. Then you ask that individual to close his or her eyes, and while the eyes are closed, you take one and reverse it. Anyone. It's the old shell game. The eyes are open, which is the most special one. And of course, it's the one where orientation has been adjusted, and the individual can identify the variation on a theme. In much too much cryptic terms, that is at least intended to set the stage, and if it's obtuse at this point, perhaps the slides will help to clarify. Tactically, strategically, what the architect wants to say, if it's to be lucid and literate, must be put into a cohesive package where each of the component parts is harmonizing and mutually supportive of the others so that the message can come across. Otherwise, it's chaos. And perhaps the easiest association to be made would be the common constant that we have shared thus far. My comments may be offensive to faculty, beyond understanding to a first-year student, of indifference to a last-year student. But the one thing that we share is the common constant, the order of the English language. And without that, there can be no communication. If one has intelligence, one can put reasons into words. And if those words are addressed to people of intelligence, they can be understood. Not necessarily agreed with, but understood. The same thing is true with the language of architecture and the literacy of architecture. Could we have the lights and the light? Oh. Now, it would be unfair to say that architecture should be fun and let it go at that, because there are certain building types where you don't exactly associate fun with the event. I doubt that a mortuary should effectively be labeled as fun, nor should the Supreme Court of the United States be so labeled, or the gas ovens at Dakota. We have a collection of building types, some unique, one of a kind, others that deal with categories that don't come under the heading of fun. But if one needs one word to capture what architects should be able to deliver as it goes about the process of this realization of a strong, positive, emotional, memorable response, then for me, as a kind of pinch on the tushy, I can't think of a better visual reference than Main Street at Disney World. If architecture is an art form, then its primary role is to function as such. That's its responsibility and that's its function. It doesn't turn out ball bearings or students on some wonderful June afternoon with a degree in hand. Architecture evokes because it has the capability and the capacity to touch men's souls. The same thing is true with all art. And while Mondrian can be said to be a bit more serious about what he was after than the designers of Disney World, though I'm not sure I personally accept that thesis, the intention is exactly the same. And the artist has used an intellectual, a highly cerebral method for attaining compositional balance, harmony, and attaching numbering systems which are in part helpful in establishing what to him is visual weight. And it's interesting that after you digest the composition, what is dominant and arrestive on first encounter becomes background and passive as one maintains a relationship with the painting. After a time has elapsed, the smallest becomes the most dominant. It's the old David and Goliath syndrome and something called a time lapse. In the 1920s, the 1930s, actually, let's say in the first third of this century, including the twilight days of the 19th, all art and architecture, or at least those on the cutting edge of architecture, were realizing that there was more in the way of opportunity for a new expressionism than the old conventional Beaux-Arts system and the continued applique of tired and fatigued techniques could provide. We find in this statue, or the sculpture by Ngabo, a set of offsetting planes of transparency, suspension, an indication of tension, support, and where Mondrian's work is two-dimensional, and as all painters can, one need not concern himself with gravity and composite planes, only the illusion of such. But once we start to make sculpture, we do have to deal with the reality of support, interdependency, the transfer of loads, and the rest, albeit at a very modest stage. And finally, we get to architecture, and perhaps architecture, the only thing that separates architecture from sculpture or painting is that architecture is an art form with toilets. And if you think of it that way, there's no possibility that it could ever become an elitist kind of expression. You're all familiar with Mises' Farnsworth House at Fox River. It uses a minimalist approach. It, of course, painted white as it is, with its skirts hiked up over the floodplains. It becomes a very dynamic expression of the aesthetic potential in our own time. So we can say that it is a variable with what is commonplace or normative at the moment of its design, both in the austerity of its line and also the materials being used. Though it does have a formality which, if one is not offended by its abrupt jerk and apparent disassociation with the past, is rather redolent with a classicism that can be taken back to Carl Friedrich Schenkel. In New Canaan, Connecticut, is Philip Johnson's glass box. And while it was influenced by Mises, it was built first. Johnson, to the best of my recollection, completed this in 1948. Mises' Farnsworth House was a year or two later. What I would look at with you to explain the subtleties between the two projects, even though each is minimal, each uses the inventory of steel sections that are found in anyone's steel yard. Johnson's is probably more Walt Whitman-esque, more American, because it doesn't establish a disassociation with the site, it grows out of the site. So in this Connecticut, this bucolic, lovely setting of affluent America in the suburbs, why you find that in this game of constant and variables, we have a disassociation in the material from the cultural past. My God, it's steel. Who lives in a steel house? Better yet, who lives in a steel house with glass walls and no blinds? Obviously, somebody who doesn't have any holes or rents in his underwear. You just can't do it. It's silk robes and fur slippers and the whole bit. Mies painted his building white. Johnson paints his black. And in so doing, we now, through the use of treatment, begin to build up an intimacy with the trees. And while this is nature, this is man. And they share in common the chromatic constant. Within the minimal, we find that the corner is anchored down. So the sense of place, within the freedom of the eye to move beyond is a subtle demarcation. This, too, is a constant. And if you look at the brick the brick podium, or perhaps the style of it is a more accurate term, it's almost as if the earth has come up and this box has been placed down on it with a great deal of precision and care. Within the minimalism is a circular drum which houses the toilet, and that's probably a very prudent act. Beyond that is a storage area for the kitchen and one for clothing. A bed and chairs complete the game. It's maximum transparency, minimum mass. It is an extroverted space. The only place where you can go to get in the fetal position, pop your thumb in your mouth, and feel secure is in the bathroom. And this idea has been carried even farther, though the slide doesn't show it, into a shower or a bathroom that is gilded in pigskin tiles. And it becomes very sensuous when one perhaps can become very self-conscious in just simply the acts that go on there. It's the curvilinear played off against the regular. Now, Johnson also built a guest house, and what's interesting about the project is that we are told that this is the quintessential act of modernism, not just minimalism, but modernism, and from here on it was all downhill until Charles Jenks figured out that modernism was dead. There is a booklet put out by the Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies. Peter Eisenman did the whole profession a very great disservice when, after years and years of others having tried, Peter was successful in obtaining from Philip Johnson the 30-some-odd sketches that went into the glass box project before he set his mind to this particular solution. And what we find there are the precursors or the progenitors of what would later become the AT&T Tower. Johnson, from the outset, was very much an historical romantic, and he had the flexibility and the dexterity to move from one extreme to the other, which perhaps is a pretty good reinforcement of the idea that the modern movement is not bereft of historical ties after all. Meanwhile, back in the guest house, where you get constants and variables and variations on a theme, where his own home was minimal and highly exposed, the guest house is totally enclosed. One was extroversion, this one is introversion. The guest house built 2 years later, and we see shades of the Arabian Nights. It's very sensual. One takes off his shoes to walk over a pile carpet that probably is 3 inches deep. There's no way that you can avoid sensory response. You look at the bed. Is it a bed for sleeping or a sacrificial altar for maidens? It's full of fantasy, and it's a terribly rich and emotional affair. There are, on one wall, on the opposite side of the door, 3 portholes carved. And the 3 portholes are the void equivalent of the plan configuration of the only introverted space in the glass box. So the guest house is totally enclosed with the same brick that's down here. It has a black fascia. It has a door of the same proportions, except the door, instead of transparent, is opaque. And what becomes the only enclosure in one is the only opening in another. And Shazam! We have the polarities. Not a versus situation, but polarities that are working in harmony with one another because they deal with contrast. Not, as Robert Venturi would have you believe, contradiction. Simply the tension that's created through contrast. It's an old architectural device. It was used effectively by the Greeks, was resurrected in Renaissance time, and was lost a little bit along the way as one revival followed another, until the modern movement replaced whatever it was it replaced. South of Atlantic Beach on Florida's east coast is a project done in the early 60s by Paul Rudolph for the Niland family. As we see this and then think back a few moments to the Mondrian painting, obviously it is an academic exercise in cubism, but it's cubism now with high relief, or perhaps on this side, bas relief. The scale of the building, which is usually a common constant, and unfortunately it's been established by Sweet's catalog. I mean, it's almost heresy to think that a door can come any higher than 6 feet 8 inches or 3 feet in width, but it is possible to make an amenity out of this liability. If we didn't have the Volkswagen and the dog, the viewer would be hard-pressed to ascertain exactly what the scale is of the building. This kind of ambiguity as a variable has been built in, and the purpose of it is to arrest attention, because man with his compulsive curiosity is forever trying to establish an expectation with his environment. Probably goes back to the cave or earlier, where the eye preceded the body to make sure nobody was going to knock on it with a stone club. But what was a necessity then carries over as a propensity today. It's a very vigorous composition. Looks complex. On the C side, the east side, it looks even more complex. But is it complex? Not really. And my suggestion would be that you dissect it. And essentially this evening is a very brief exercise in architectural anatomy, and we're doing what some of your friends in medical school do, but with less aroma. First of all, the building faces due east. Those of you who are functionalists at heart will be offended, because there's no way that you can control the sunrise as it comes zooming out of the Atlantic someplace west of the Azores. And you can see that this individual, even though this is eventide, is all prepared for tomorrow morning. He or she knows what the limits of this kind of orientation are. There's no sunscreen in Harvard that can control the light when it's facing due east. But if you want a view, this is the price you pay for it. Back into the anatomy of the building, notice how simple it really is. A. Right? Don't have a stutter. That's an ongoing, and another A. That's an ongoing part of the system. Then you find that the section above, the section there are equal to what you find adjacent to it in this run. And this element falls into the same kind of regulation. And of course, all of it's tied up in a tidy package and given legitimacy with the overdrawing of the Fibonaccian series, Renaissance regulating lines, and anything else that can be plucked from J. Hambidge's book called Dynamic Symmetry. It's a very formalist building, though it would not normally be thought of in those terms. As we run between the two extremities, it has a beginning and an end and an eccentrically placed middle. We normally think of a belly button in the center, but this one is there, eccentrically located and actually giving a profile that culminates with the highest point against the sky, and then as a frame for the two chimneys that are addressed in a perpendicular relationship. The variable is one that is so varied in the composition that the complexity overrides our capacity to effectively ferret out the commonalities that fuse the element together. And this is purposely done. The architect who is the designer of the project is a hedonist. He has an insatiable desire to extract not only that strong positive emotional response, but keep the individual involved until he or she drops from emotional fatigue. In the South, we all know of Gone with the Wind, of Scarlet and Rhett, and frankly, my dear, I Don't Give a Damn, and all of those wonderful things that signal the end of the antebellum period. In Athens, Alabama, and as you see the project emerge, you'll wonder where else. It couldn't have been built anyplace else. Using a cultural set of codes and clues and cues as a common denominator, Rudolph built for a affluent couple, and one shouldn't be offended by affluence, you know. Architecture is commissioned by those of means. either private or corporate means. I don't think you can expect the vagrants or migrants or itinerants of the world to be very good clients for architects. The question is whether the architecture has a universality that can communicate, and this one probably does. It speaks about an era long since past, and one that has become a part not only of American history, but of American mythology. This is a modern update of a southern plantation, but it resorts to none of the appliques, cosmetic devices, or techniques that are currently being proffered by those who would merrily pluck ad nauseum from the pages of Sir Bannister Fletcher or some other reference manual. You move in the automobile to the far end, swing around, come back to the object, continue on until you finally stop, emerge from the automobile, and let's go through that again, backwards. The ability to be exposed for the duration of the length of the longitudinal axis before finally coming to a pause point. Now, it may not be a happy composition, it may not be appealing, but it's most certainly not something that can be ignored as vapid or passive. The project is laid out on a podium, and in the best traditions of classical architecture, once more, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, or if you will, a base, a shaft, and the capital. But unlike the Doric, Ionic, or Corinthian columns, this is a capital that is responsive to an erosive process rather than an additive one. The idea is a constant, a celebration of the joint between the continuous cornice and the column. That is a constant. The technique, the methodology, is a variable. And you find in the system a continuation of the sense of density of the column as this dimension then becomes a hook that roars out of the podium as the same kind of curvilinear termination, the lowest tread extending beyond to establish tension again, not the normative treatment of a set of stairs, highly incised so that sun and shadow generate, and before you know it, you're up on the podium and ready to go in. It's the kind of stairway that would have brought great joy to the heart of Busby Berkeley and his dancing darlings. It's a tripartite organization where there is the active, the passive, and the active, or if you will, a brace of solids, a resultant void, and a brace of solids. And these two grand promenades or colonnades march down the extremities of the building. There is on the public side an attempt to achieve privacy, which is a judicious and very logical approach. And then finally, as we think of how you move to the building and around, and to give a little relief, because architecture should never be ponderous and boring, this is the stuff of which ceremony, sequence, and procession are made. Here we can watch the marching guards. Here we become the vehicle whereby the optical system marches around the files of static columns. Kinetic architecture doesn't mean that the architecture has to move. Kineticism can be achieved by simply very carefully programming the orientation and the introduction and the exposure and the time of involvement before we finally arrive at. And on the far side, the structure opens up. We have the two-story colonnade, the porch, the pavilion, the kind of lifestyle that is certainly very appropriate in the South where the soft breezes blow. I somehow, on the basis of the weather outside this building, don't see this as ever being a very popular style in this part of the country. This is the regular, the constant, and the constant then is broken up into, the column is a constant, the spacing becomes variegated, so that it's A, B, A, B. For you musicians, it might be loud, soft, loud, soft, loud, soft, major, minor, major, minor. It gives a dichotomy where a column can be read singly, or a resultant column is a product of the solid void and the solid. And all of these are are very, very complex and yet simply forged or simply orchestrated elements of interaction. And to play off the regular, there is the singular varied element in the form of the fireplace, its chimney, and of course the ever-present grand staircase where the debutante will make her grand entrance some fine moonlit June evening. And we even have a throwback for those who need the ties with the past and how many porches in the United States have and have had traditionally the white wicker furniture. It's a modern piece of architecture that oozes with romance. I would be of the opinion that it stops short of rather cloying sentimentality, but its origins and ties with the Southern past that is of sentimental disposition are unmistakable. And it's done by a man who is fully dedicated to exploiting architecture without the limits imposed by any kind of a stylistic preoccupation. This is extraction, quintessential expression through the rearrangement and resurrection of an idea, not the duplication of tactical stylistic events. And now as the sun sinks slowly in the west, we bid farewell to Athens, Alabama, and the resurrection of the southern plantation. It's the Lazarus Act, really, and would do justice to anything found in the Bible. And of course is not that far removed from George's retreat back in Virginia. In New Haven, another product by Rudolph. I won't go into the way in which the building is orchestrated and structured. What I want to get at is that this building, as it sits at the corner of Chapel and York Street, is one half of probably what is as strong an entry gate into any university or any sub-community to be found any place in the world. And what makes it possible was the juxtapositioning or the preparation by Louis I. Kahn in the Yale Art Gallery of 1952. You see the two buildings riding off and playing off against each other. The frenetic rock singer against this soft spiritualist, the profusion of high animation, the dominant vertical line played off against this almost silent composition of unarticulated brick wall with only the horizontal string course. Rudolph would not have been able to do this if Kahn hadn't done that. It was a preparation of the passive in anticipation that whoever came next would be free to do whatever he chose. In that respect, it's a most remarkable building on Kahn's part, nor is that the end of it. There is on this section of Chapel Street even another building, and you have four generations of the arts at Yale. Street Hall, which is a product of perhaps an 1830 or 40 Gothic revival. Then we come to a turn of the century Renaissance revival, also very active, and you can see the way this is active, passive, and active begin to set up an interplay between these three elements by virtue of contrast, comparison, of complexity, of simplicity, of variation, which makes them hang together in a very unusual fashion. There are many places in Europe, few places in the United States, where you have this kind of vitality and also this kind of cooperation between architects and what they have left for posterity. Put as simply as one can, gateways are fun, they're compelling, they invite, they beckon, and they can demand. The timid, of course, will stay away because they will fear that the gates may open and the chargers come out, but those of us who are curious will probably go all the way down the line and try each door. Then that sets up a new set of options or possibilities. Doorways have been the subject of lavish architectural devices and very costly projects throughout the whole of man's history. Once more, a project by Rudolph that relates to the automobile offers a gateway at Colgate University, where town and gown meet, and in a small New England town, town and gown relationships are more often frayed than they are compatible. I show you this because it's a wonderful example that can be very quickly digested of constants and variables as the composition is once more extracted from very simple controls and given a high level of complexity. There is the grand cornice line. Within the cornice line, to make sure that the eye doesn't pass too quickly from one extremity to the other, the architect has gotten out the can opener and he's cranked up these four elements, replete with the positive, negative. He's produced a great deal of complexity so that the cornice has the capability to assert itself as something more than a subservient agent for the making of this grand, monumental Homeric gateway. We don't have a pointer, do we? No, all right. If you look at the height of the cornice is equal to the width between the paired columns again. And here we go with this variegated of small, large, major, minor, major, minor. The cornice extends beyond in an excessive cantilever, which gives you a very arresting kind of crotch point at the terminals. And when we get out here, you find that what is void now becomes rotated 90 degrees and is a solid. And all of the other insies and outsies, yin-yangs, place, push, press, release occurs within the matrix of the building, which can be examined and reduced to a very simple equation. And as you move around the building, whoops, thought I had another slide. All right. Of all of the events in our own time, probably the one, ironically, that American architects seem to consistently ignore the most is the provision for a place for the automobile. If we think of a garage, we think of something where bicycles are stored, garbage cans. It's a ghetto in our own home. But if we think of the automobile as perhaps occupying either, well, let's say the garage is not a garage any longer, it's a bedroom for automobiles. Now, one does not want to get seduced by semantics, but think of horses. You can keep horses in a barn, and that has a certain image generation. But if we keep horses in a stable, then obviously the situation and the amenities have slightly improved. This is the French house in Dayton, Ohio. It was done in, I have a very poor memory for dates, I think it was done, or they moved in 1968 or 69. It is unabashedly a game of constant and variables and elements of continuity and contrast. The flat roof section is the spinal column, the elements that graft to it for nourishment establish a means of introducing light into the interior and also giving the whole a sense of a community of smaller structures. The garage and the automobile are, or I should say the automobile is accommodated in a turnaround, or if you will, a pen. The automobile then is given its bedroom off to the right within the system of concrete block, which is exposed inside and out. There are the reductions of the materials to give elements that can face off and communicate across court. The cardinal points are established. North, it is up. The house was for a family of 5. 2 children were still living there. The husband is a patent attorney, and the mother, in addition to being a mother and a homemaker, is a working sculptor and painter who probably logs 12 to 15 hours a day at her craft and art. It had to be many things other than simply a home. One moves to the opposite side of the building, and at first, and it's not just a product of the axonometric, because an attempt was made to distribute balance around the 2 fireplace or the 2 chimneys that rise above the roof line. It's almost, or certainly difficult to identify that you are on the same side, and the slide has been reversed. The common element is the cornice line. The variable is the height factor as the house is engaged with its site rather than sitting on a podium as some of the earlier slides showed. Not that one method is any less or more superior to another. It simply constitutes a dissimilar attack or approach to how buildings relate to the ground. And the fragmentation, the additive quality can be seen here. You enter at the top, which is a reversal of the normative. We normally expect it will enter on the bottom, and the private precinct is above. You enter at the top. Off to the right is a bridge that is a suspension over the commons area within the house. On one side of that bridge, by inference rather than decree, is the living room with its fireplace and the studio on the other. Master bedroom below, 2 children's bedrooms, a kitchen below, a guest study, and large, high, hopefully intriguing volumes emerging as one rounds the corner. It is a collection of discrete rooms in the best tradition of Beaux-Arts and classical planning, except the volumes are engaged and overlap with one another in such a manner as to hopefully to compulsively pull. These are studies that were done and then formalized by Mr. Niland when he, like you, was attempting to meet academic requirements. In point of fact, the house was designed with this awareness of the multiplicity of influences, for rarely is architecture forged by the singular. Or it may start with a singular set of circumstances or a singular set of solutions to a given problem, and then it simply expands exponentially. Concrete block, inside and out, can be a rather large pill to swallow if one thinks about concrete block not as a humble material, but as a poor man's material. It's what we normally find in the back of the building or on the sides. We get brick on the front, but here it is, for better or for worse. You can see the diagonal in the hill as a variable, the cornice line as a constant, the differentiation between the narrow movable windows and the larger fixed glass structures. Movement into the motor court, the entryway being played off as a means of establishing attention and dialogue by the section of roof rising over the dining room, and the dimensions are the same. My recollection is that it's 12 feet. There's no question where the automobile belongs, but to make sure that the pedestrian doesn't stumble his way in there, here's the extended arm in salutation with everything but a hand on the end. And it's intended that the set of cues that you find all the way from the macro to the micro ultimately deposit the visitor at the door, whether it be on only one occasion or a reoccurring use. The door itself, and this combination of materials, is an illustration of how one hopes to communicate at a subliminal level. All too often, we find that our buildings are composed of quarreling elements, or elements that quarrel with one another because of a lack of unity in dimension or a lack of homogeneity because of the absence of integration. The concrete block is 8 by 16 and it's 8 inches wide. The tile fits in as 4-inch increments, and you can see how the designer really didn't have to make any determinations. All he had to do was orchestrate and unify and then ride herd on the contractor. And when you take your eye up to the point where the wood-clad bonnets meet the concrete block wall, you can find that the 2-inch on center of those striations also lines up. The reveal between the contiguous segments in the texture 111 are 3/8 of an inch, and the conventional mortar joint in block and tile is also 3/8 of an inch. So if one is a good boy and says his prayers at night, you can throw away the rule and simply use the modular increment as a way of organizing and of providing an order that comes through not consciously, for I think that would be oppressive. It simply offers an underlying sense of unity. Once on the inside, there's a suspension and the reversal of roles. If you're a stranger in the house for the first time, it's marvelous how easily one can be assimilated because you're very frequently greeted from below. So the act of dominant subordinates is reversed, and in the process, the familiar or the object becomes eminently more familiar in a shorter period of time. At the far end of the hallway, just off to the left, is a flight of stairs. Off to the right is the studio. There are the stairs floating. We normally expect to find solidity at the solid and the very resistive, and if you move on these stairs downward, you're not aware of what occurs as you move back up. The difference between moving in and moving out, moving up and moving down. You can see the studio as a vehicle and a receptacle for the artist's work so that it can be hung there and she can have an ongoing encounter with it. And through that longevity of association, osmosis works its magic, and it's possible to learn well after the fact, and certainly well after the piece itself is dead cold. A studio can also be a different. She was, however, game to set up a contrasting source of high illumination that comes from the south. The idea being that in the wintertime when the sun was low, it would be received by the building, bounce off of the silver lining in the bonnet, and act as an effective adjunct to the normal light. It works in the summer. The architect didn't plan very, I'm sorry, it works in the winter. The architect didn't plan very well in the summer, and she all but has to wear sunglasses. Something that's complete before occupancy may well be overkill after occupancy occurs. If the artwork were pulled out of this house, it would be incomplete. It was consciously designed as a neutral foil to receive the art. God help the next buyer or owner if they don't have a rather extensive collection of art or access to a lot of Marimekko fabrics. Because without the polychrome elements of focus, it does become somewhat dungeon-esque. A dining room with Arne Jacobsen's chairs designed for St. Catherine's College, the chair being an intended pre-source or pre-animator for the table, pre-populating the table, and a seduction device to get you at the table, to sit in the chair, to be enveloped by it, and suddenly be very actively partaking in not only the comestibles, but also the conviviality and the social aspects of dining. When the two doors are open, it becomes a screened-in porch for all practical purposes because of the proportional system. The height from the floor to the apex point of the bonnet is 26 feet. It attenuates and exaggerates vertical volume in the hope of providing an appropriate shared communal, it's the great hall. And they do have large dogs, and it would be marvelous if one could get away with throwing the occasional bone to the hound in the best tradition of Anglo-Saxon. A project for a doctor in a wheelchair, a doctor who at the age of 45, and who should have known better, never got his polio shots. He and his wife went to Mexico for a vacation. He was bitten by the flies, and now will spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. How a system can be evolved from the simple necessities of elevating an individual in a wheeled vehicle from the outside to the inside. And the two slides pretty well tell the tale. On the right is the composition that endeavors to establish a sense of place. On the left is this collection of portal points which emphasize the act of movement in and movement out. The scheme can best be understood in the plans. A very modest house, the front-facing facade treated only in a minimal fashion to give a clue to what lies behind. And then, of course, to the rear of the building where it can do no mischief to neighbors, all hell breaks loose. This is one of those projects that has a tendency to design itself. So many lineal feet in order to negotiate the dissimilarity in heights. If it came straight out, there's a property line just about where the bottom of the screen is and a golf course beyond. If it came straight out, the doctor would have been just about deposited on the 17th green. That didn't seem too intelligent. So the next step is to reduce the distance by half, and you do that by coming back on yourself. The easiest angle to use is 45, because most workmen can deal with a 45, but if you give them a 33 1/3 degree, it does cause consternation and a tendency to walk off the job. If you consider that there has to be a landing in order to get back to where you came from, and then you simply expand the landing, shazam, you have a 19th century gazebo or a folly. It becomes a thing for fun and games. Whoops. It's a piece of sculpture. The house is 2 stories. The roofscape has to be eminently successful as a composition as any other aspect of the building. And I think all too frequently we lose the opportunity to exploit the roof as a 5th facade, figuratively speaking. And the source of the composition, in addition to the exigencies, the logistics, the simple intelligence of planning, is predicated on a rising shaft around an elevator at this point. That's a positive solid. It helps to anchor. It's like a windmill or a grain tower. Here's the portal that takes the individual from the garage into the system. At the reverse point, or the landing, you have the reciprocal for the solid shaft, which is the positive void. If you choose, you can call it Anthony and Cleopatra, his and hers. It certainly has very, very strong sexual overtones. You can see the portal points, all of it being made intentionally complex. And finally, back to where we began, and you'll notice that there is an elaboration of the vertical again. The normative and the unique, the contrast and the elements of continuity come into play here, not only in the physical stuff of which the composition has evolved, but also as a statement of intention. If, as a 7-foot round ball player, one can dunk the ball, and he's then thrown to a 5'7" player who, unless he has access to a stepladder, can't conceivably do the same thing, then the advantage goes to the taller man. If you simply take that very, very simple analogy and apply it to a man in a wheelchair, if the architecture is a reflection of normal, conventional dimensions, then the man in the wheelchair is deprived, psychologically, spiritually, symbolically deprived of access that once was his. But if the ceiling soars up to 10 or 12 feet, then it's no more in the reach of those who are still ambulatory than it is for the individual in the wheelchair. Hence, what belongs to no one belongs to everyone. And the central oculus offers an opportunity for the doctor to have his torso in the sunshine and his feet in the shade, because the absence of circulation to the lower extremities means that the feet easily swell. So one can take a programmatic necessity, a physical liability, and while it can't help the man get out of the chair and walk again, it can turn the place in which he lives into an asset. It's a piece of whimsy. It's a piece of necessity. It's an attempt to fuse, not even ameliorate, the differences between the art of architecture and the necessity of building. very quickly in these last slides, if I can. Remodeling, and that's an unfair term. I don't think one remodels. If you take an existing building, it's a treasure hunt. Exactly and precisely a treasure hunt. And one examines what is for clues and cues, and you then respond to these. Cincinnati is made up of 7 hills, not ridges, but hills. And on one of these hills is a collection of blue-collar worker homes circa 1860. And even though the views are magnificent, it was a working-class community because in those days the affluent lived in the valley, and they all burned coal as a primary fuel. And all of the coal dust went on the hills and left a pall, not only on the buildings, but in the lungs of those who lived there. Now, of course, since we're burning other things, it's become very fashionable to buy these old buildings at exorbitant prices and redo them. And in this case, I think it would have probably been cheaper for the client if he'd raised the building, which he could have done probably in 20 minutes, and started afresh. But you can get the character. It's 2 stories on the upper level, and it's 3 or 4 on the lower. This is the facade to the street, and a rather vapid and banal collection of non-events on its fanning. This is what was done. Notice, if you will, the frontal angle and the profile of the dormer, the existence of the porch. What was maintained was the spirit of the building by the retention of its basic configuration and its basic enclosure. Beyond the limits of that building, then, was a process of rather vigorous addition. In plan, you can see it perhaps more clearly. A lot of gymnastics exercised in the addition of all of this stuff right here. And I can never remember, is it Mother's Oats or Quaker Oats that comes in that wonderful cylinder? That was the concept for this business right here. And once you put the oats box in there, then you take a very sharp mat knife and begin to slash away at it. And as you move higher up in the scheme of things, the windows change. The point at the upper right was a constant. The 45-degree angle was in deference to the access to a view, which is a physiological or a geographic given because of the juxtapositioning of the structure to the Ohio River and the wonderful views it affords. And finally, the attempt to be not a part of, but a part within. There's a common party wall. The one piece of goodies that was found on the dwelling, you can see, has been maintained. The downspout also was retained because it gave an eccentric reference point, and then all of the rest of this stuff begins to slide by. And there you can see the top of the oats box, not dissimilar to the kind of design that Gaudi put on top of the Casa Mia, or perhaps it could be an architectonic cousin of Darth Vader. Certainly that would be the case if the building were painted black instead of white. This is Mary's house. It's my wife's house. We live together. We're reasonably happy as a woman can be with an architect. And it's her house because it's the old story of the shoemaker's children. She was promised it for approximately 150 years before it was finally delivered. It has multiple meanings. It's intended to have certain clear associations with the culture of the Ohio River Valley, and it offers continuity in that sense. And very, very briefly, it can be read, it's intended to be read. It's intended to be read by any number of different layers of the enlightened. Let's assume that the individual who lives in the universal, ubiquitous American ranch house, but an affluent one, perhaps can read the active area at one end, that's usually the bedrooms,
And the active area on the other end, that's for the automobile. And then we do all sorts of things in between. And there's the chimney. And of course, we all adore chimneys. They play hell with the thermostat, but they do remind us of hearth and home and Keith and kin and mom and dad and brotherhood and motherhood and all of those other things. And if you're going to have a chimney, why not attenuate the chimney? I'd always had great affection for phallic symbols, and this is the largest one on a private residence in southwestern Ohio, and is dedicated to a friend of mine named Stanley Tigerman, who many of you have heard of. The game also then continues. If you know the territory of southwestern Ohio, its origins were in very simple white clapboard farm buildings. The white clapboard, of course, being horizontal in its application. This is 3-inch boards. It's white. The orientation becomes the variable, so it's vertical. If you are an Ohio River buff, then perhaps you can see the bow or the prow, the stern, the wheelhouse, and the chimney arising amidships. And if you are among the anointed of the world and are interested in architecture, then you might say, aha, I've seen that before in the hills of Vicenza. It belonged to Andrea Palladio, and it's a very formal exercise in the stuff of which Renaissance architecture is made. And the answer is yes, no, and all of the above. And the intention is cerebral and intellectual and academic because it had to be a one-floor building to make it possible for 2 doctors in wheelchairs that I have worked for to get in and out of the place. A provision again for the automobile, but now at a very subtle level. Let's see, I think it probably shows up better in the drawings. It's a tripartite scheme, a variation on Marcel Breuer's binuclear scheme, which was predicated on daytime, nighttime activities, as many of you know. Let's say this would be a trinuclear scheme, which relates more to use, simple use, rather than structured use for daytime and nocturnal activities. In the center is the entry. You can see that the entry on the south side, the house, by the way, sits at the end of a meadow, of a dog-leg meadow. And the architect had nothing to do with that except to put the damn building where he wouldn't have to cut down some trees. The entryway is to the left or the west of a central zipper down the building. That too. I'm drifting, but you see, it's marvelous how many different sources one can tap into for inspiration. I had a critic when I was in school named Serge Chimaev, who had more rules than an umpire at a baseball game. And one of them was that you could not put a column in the middle of anything without destroying continuity. You could not enter on a column. He should have told that to the Greeks who produced the first Doric temples, because there was one column in the center. But Chimaev maintained that this couldn't be done, and I knew if I ever built a home for myself, I wanted to put a column dead in the center. And then, again, make an amenity out of it. You can see the column, which becomes a pier in the center, and as you move from one side to the other, the element of connection, this transition element on the north side, has its flank on that same center line, and what is a solid column or a solid pier on the outer perimeter of the building becomes the focus point for the positive void within and the slit within the fireplace mass. You can see the whole thing right here, right up the center. Very, very simply organized. On the ends, a living room entry and a living room, 40 feet by I don't know what. The building is 80 feet long by 40 feet, so it's a 2-to-1 rectangle. There's no way you can get into mischief with that. You're automatically moral and ethical and a good guy. And then each of the end units is again a 2-to-1 element, 20 feet by 40 feet. On the ends are the specialty parts of the house, 2 of which are bedrooms. to the south, on the west, and to the north, on the east. They are duplicates, very, very small. This satisfies the people who lend money. In point of fact, one isn't a bedroom at all, but my office. That's introverted. They are duplicates of one another. Then the kitchen dining room, which has a different function and a different need, a different set of demands, is a variation on what goes on in the master bedroom. And at either end of the building, in order to bring light, because light is a giver of life, there are monitors. And on the south face, there's a north monitor, and the north face, there's a south monitor. These give you the beginning, the middle, and the end, and you find then that the monitors that rise over the megaron, the fireplace location, are a micro reflection of the macro, where you have high, low, and high. The variable there is that the exchange of the transparent and the opaque. And the juxtapositioning of the low on the extremities of the transparent and the high opaque is used as a backboard to play off of the natural events. The dog looks much more sinister than he is. There are no neighbors within easy visual reach, so there are no blinds. This becomes a variation on Philip Johnson's glass box in New Canaan. Now on the inside, there's a porch on the back. What are all of the things that Americans want? Well, they want garages. Unfortunately, there are no garages here. But there is a deck and a terrace and a fireplace and a place for loudspeakers, like the hi-fi speakers. A gesture has been made to incorporate all of what is generally considered to be desirable, but in a manner that rearranges the priorities, so that instead of being the stuff which is placed out for perusal by one's friends, it's subjugated and only becomes assertive when it is alive. The columns on the outside, there's only one freestanding column. That becomes an intellectual game. Columns on the inside are offset so that they're on the center of the columnar location on the inside. It's a 10-foot grid divided up into 3'4" units, 3 meters and 2 meters, and it occurs on the inside in the same fashion. And the 4 columns, as you read them free, the only 4 on the interior that read free are a playback to the Greek megaron, which was 4 columns with a fireplace in the center and a hole in the roof. Once more, the game. Something for everyone, depending on the level of cognizance, perception, and knowledge. Fireplace is painted white on the inside, so that as it grows older, a patina that illustrates its use, constant and variable again, rather than having the black hole of Calcutta looking back at you. And then returning to the outside in the hope that once one has been through the session, the elements are perhaps endowed with even a greater sense of animation, having returned to the exterior, and the scheme is intended to glow at night with very careful location of artificial illumination from all sorts of mysterious points. Rarely does one visually address a light bulb per se. And lastly, the most recent project for another doctor in a wheelchair, a young man who returned to his alma mater, William College, to play in a varsity alumni rugby game. He was turned upside down and his spinal column was broken. And at the age of 28, he was condemned to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. I suppose, since you don't know it, you won't realize that the slides are in backwards, so I won't tell you that. It'll be interesting to see how it looks the other way around. Let's go back. The house is at the top of a meadow after you've driven down a ravine, and the entranceway is very heavily wooded. So there's a certain kind of Midsummer Night's Dream quality, a romance and a mysticism as you roar out of the forest and upon the building.
The square in the center, as you see it in the plan, is 60 feet by 60 feet, or 6 units of 10-foot bay. The outer elements then are each, as you perhaps will notice, of varying size. You enter through the building. It's nominally 2 stories on the upper side. It has, as per the project in the south, a unifying cornice. After all, Rudolph didn't patent that element. Off on the left is parking for 6 guest vehicles. Off on the right, underneath the oculus, is internal parking. You can see the re-emergence of the Fearless Phalanx in the center, used for unifying again. The warts on the roof are corrals around the mechanical equipment. The house is overviewed by neighbors, so it too is a fifth facade. You can identify the chimney. And here it sits on its hillside, attempting to be both highly complex and yet very legible and very simple at the same time. It faces south. The three-dimensional layered quality in the composition is a product of a brise-soleil, which I'm told by the mechanical engineer works, which I also then consider to be either an act of God or pure happenstance. Off on the left, you can find the pivotal point in the scheme, which then works its way back. And one moves through a series of visual references which identify, if one has the time to peruse it, the various events that are being supported behind that facade. Now, monumentality is employed here and hopefully to be enjoyed by those who occupy the system. I don't think it makes any difference whether it's a salt factory out of the 18th century by Claude Nicolas Ledoux or a modest woodcutter's cottage in the Ohio hills. The monumentality is not something that was manufactured by any particular group during the course of history. The monumentality that seems to be so important where appropriately used in our world seem to be a device, and when I say seem, I'm not hedging. It seemed to me to be the appropriate element to bring a quality of life to an individual, again, who is seriously deterred in his accessibility to all of the things that those of us who are ambulatory take for granted. Those lessons that were learned in the Hanneson house for the other doctor in the wheelchair with his gazebo cum folly were applied here. Obviously, the project is measurably larger in scope and far more complex in its intention. But principals have a wonderful way of supporting you and offering reapplication where they serve. I'm flashing back and forth between the drawings and the actual site just to give you a feel of the spirit of the dwelling. This is the uphill side. The long connector that you see coming out is a fire escape so that he can get out of the master bedroom. This is a deck which makes it possible. It's one of roughly 14 venues. Anyone in a wheelchair obviously is not going to do very well on a site like this. And the appeal of the site was generated by a phenomenal view. No, it really doesn't show it anything slot. So in order to give him a great deal of variety, again, the constant accessibility to variety or the variable, 14 devices have been used within or extending from the house so that he can go on holiday without ever leaving the compound. And hopefully his life will be enriched by this kind of accessibility. The column is used as the regulated device, and you can see it in increments of 10. The column, as a common constant, is abandoned when you get to the extremities for the simple purpose that it imposes on the architect the necessity to resolve each of those corner points in a different fashion. And consequently, the grid doesn't become a panacea or a narcotic or a crutch. Here's the entryway into the scheme, a narrow slit window
that helps to locate the center. I'll go through the dialogue between the various component parts when we get on the inside, and the location of one of the mechanical corrals, which kind of adds an exclamation point. The plan, the concept, if it was a concept, or perhaps it was only an organizational ordering element at the strategic level, is predicated not on the Alhambra in Spain, though it could be, not on Windsor Castle, though it could be, but on the organization of the traditional Danish farmhouse, where in one quadrant the family lives, in a second quadrant are the animals, in the third quadrant storage, and in the fourth quadrant the utensils and implements that till the land. The scheme is organized around a ramp, which you see, I guess it shows better here. Well, it doesn't really. You can see where the ramp is located. There is a concavity at the point of entry, which emphasizes and accentuates and celebrates the simple business of moving through a door. And the door is 4 feet wide, and I think it's 13 feet high, and it will be on ball bearings. And it's the same principle at work. Ain't no way anybody's going to touch the header of that one. All of the workable stuff is cranked out, as you see on the upper side of the view side. And down below it continues. I won't go into all of this because I really don't think it's all that important at the moment. There's a helper's house. Or two helpers' facilities. One's here and one's down below. There's the master bedroom. The master bedroom faces east, even though we all know that east is always to the left because the slides are in backwards, it's to the right. An elevator, stairs. The entryway is a point of divergence, a point of convergence, and it's impossible for anyone, whether ambulatory or in a wheelchair, to go from one of the 7 levels to another without always coming back on this key reference, constants and variables again. The court, I think, can speak for itself. The columns become free. They set up an articulation, a reticulation, and a rhythm. And the width of the column becomes the width of the cut in the bollard. The bollard holds a lighting element. Here's one of these 14 venues I mentioned, where he can either deliver political speeches or conduct Easter sunrise services. There's the entryway. The offset, again, the slit window being a continuation of the width of the column, and the offset that you see here being that same 8.5 inches. And there are lights up in there, so the walls get washed, and the whole thing is supposed to be very theatrical and very sensuous as you come in and go out. And you do get some semblance of a view. Oh, perhaps I forgot to tell you, the house is still under construction. She's not that bad a housekeeper. The regulating lines, the offsetting planes of the brise-soleil, and all of the rest of the equipment that supposedly will make the house a better buy in energy conservation. And the sweep and the drama of the ramp, which is obviously going to be exploited as an amenity. If one has to have a ramp because someone's in a wheelchair, then when you consider what it costs, because it takes 108 feet, I think, to move up 9 feet, it better deliver more than just access between one level and another. And a reprise. That's a screened-in porch with a deck on it. Everything you've always wanted and probably have to wait 30 years to get. If you have to have your back broken, why, it's better not to be on food stamps. And the whole scheme is, to reiterate, predicated on a jump in scale, so that just within that simple jump, there is the arrest, the contact, and the establishment, one hopes, of empathy. That's the Hawkins house. Its complexity, predicated on a simple base of technical, tactical, strategical devices, and given animation, wit, order, and consistency through a conscious manipulation of what is variable and what is constant. Thank you.